That fall was the first time we truly felt free. Ben and I had just graduated, and before confronting the suffocating office life or the grueling halls of graduate school, we wanted a trip to remember. It wasn't to be a typical summer vacation with crowded resorts or expensive European cities. We craved a more authentic experience, something raw like the kind of things you'd see on adventurous travel forums. We decided we would camp our way through the national forests of the Pacific Northwest, armed with nothing but Ben's old pickup truck, a tent, and a tragically meager budget. Our plan was ambitious for two amateurs. We would venture deep onto the seldom-used trails, searching for pristine, isolated spots that not every tourist knew about. My father, a former park ranger, had warned us about straying too far from the marked areas. He said there were remote regions even public servants avoided, places where the law seemed not to exist. But at 22, with the invincible feeling of youth, we dismissed his concerns as unnecessary warnings. We wanted adventure, and the vague sense of danger only made the trip more appealing. The first few days of the trip were fantastic. We hiked through vast pine forests, cooked over a campfire, and slept beneath a canopy of stars. But the deeper we drove inland, the more we realized we were slowly getting lost. The paper maps became useless, and the GPS signal on our phones flickered and died. One afternoon, after hours of circling on unnamed dirt roads, we realized we were completely off track. Ben's truck was starting to overheat, and we knew we needed to find a place to stop for the night and reassess. That's when we came across a small, dilapidated gas station sitting forlornly by the side of the road, looking like a relic from a bygone era. It was the only man-made structure we had seen for hours. Inside, an elderly man with a scraggly beard and tired eyes sat behind the counter. He watched us, two obvious outsiders with an undisguised curiosity. Ben spread the map out and asked him about a good nearby campsite. The man squinted, looked at the map, and pointed to a distant spot. He described the unnecessarily complex, convoluted route, going through unmarked side roads to an hidden valley that he claimed was picturesque. There was something in the decisive way he insisted on this route that made me uneasy, as if he was trying too hard to convince us. He also asked how long we planned to stay and where we were going next. Despite our suspicion, we didn't have many options. We thanked the man, filled up the tank, and followed his directions. The road was exactly as he described, confusing and winding. At times, it was little more than a gravel path that was easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. After nearly an hour of driving, we finally arrived at what was supposed to be the Hidden Valley. It was indeed beautiful, a flat clearing surrounded by towering fir trees and a gently babbling creek. But there was a strange stillness to the place, an eerie sense of isolation. We were the only ones there. As we set up our tent, I noticed a few strange signs. There were deep tire tracks etched into the soft ground, not the kind of treads a normal tourist vehicle would have. And near the edge of the woods, I found a dead campfire, but instead of burnt branches, it contained melted fragments of metal and plastic, looking like industrial waste. A sense of unease crept in, the feeling that this was not simply a campsite. We tried to dismiss our worries and enjoy the evening. Ben built a fire and I prepared our simple meal. As night fell, the forest came alive with its own sounds. But then, amidst the chirping insects and the rustling wind through the leaves, I heard another sound, the sound of an engine approaching. An old faded red pickup truck with no license plates slowly drove into our clearing. My heart started to pound. The truck stopped about 50 yards from us. A man got out. Even from a distance, I could make out his stature, tall and heavily built. He didn't approach us but just stood there, leaning against his truck, watching us. We tried to act normal, continuing with our tasks, but all my senses were focused on the stranger. His presence was like a silent intrusion, an unspoken warning. After what felt like 10 endless minutes, he got back into his truck and drove away, disappearing behind the trees. Ben breathed a sigh of relief, assuming it was just a lost local, but I didn't. I had the feeling he was checking us out, sizing us up. The feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and persistent. That night, I barely slept. Every snapped twig or hoot of an owl startled me. I kept thinking about the man at the gas station and his strange directions, about the red truck and the silent man. a chilling realization began to form. We had been lured here. This was no coincidence. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps, not the soft padding of an animal. These were human footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our camp. I nudged Ben awake, signaling him to be quiet. We lay still in the tent, holding our breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside. A long, tense silence followed, so thick I could hear my own heart thumping in my chest. Then we heard a subtle but distinct hissing sound, repeated. As dawn broke, we cautiously peered out of the tent. Everything seemed normal except for one thing. Both rear tires of Ben's truck were flat. There were 2 neat, clean cuts in the sidewalls. Someone had deliberately punctured them. We were stranded. A suffocating feeling of helplessness and fear washed over me. A sort of airless weight, where you're not quite choking, but you can feel it closing in. We didn't have a second spare tire. We knew we had to walk out for help, to get back to the main road we had taken the day before. We quickly packed the essentials into our backpacks. Water, a little food, a compass. As we were about to leave, the red pickup truck appeared again. This time it was parked right at the entrance to the valley, blocking our path. The man from yesterday stepped out, and this time he walked directly toward us. As he got closer, I could see his face clearly. He was a white man, maybe 50, with harsh, weathered features and cold eyes. He didn't say a word, just looked at us, then at our flat-tired truck with a barely perceptible smile. He was holding something in his hand. In the morning sun, I saw it glint. A large knife, nothing needed to be said. We understood the message perfectly. We didn't belong here and we had to go, but not the way we came. He simply jerked his head toward the dense forest in the opposite direction. That was where he wanted us to go. Adrenaline surged, and we turned and started running. Not a sprint down a street, but a desperate flight through the undergrowth and thick trees. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his eyes on us. He didn't chase us. He didn't need to. He just needed to make sure we wouldn't turn around. We kept running, scrambling up slopes, wading through streams with no idea where we were going. It wasn't until late afternoon, exhausted and panicked, that we stumbled upon a marked hiking trail. A few hours later, we were found by a pair of hikers who drove us to the nearest ranger station. When we told our story to a ranger, he just shook his head and called us fools, not unkindly, but with a weary frustration at our naivety. He explained that the area we had camped in was notorious for drug manufacturers and smugglers. That hidden valley was one of their spots. The man at the gas station was likely a lookout, who had deliberately sent us there so the others could handle us. The police were notified, but as we suspected, they couldn't do much. Our descriptions of the man and his truck were too vague. There was no evidence. Our trip was completely ruined. We returned home the next day. Neither of us talked much about what happened, but I knew it had changed us. The invincible sense of youthful freedom had vanished, replaced by a deep caution and an inherent fear. I will never forget the feeling of isolation in that valley, the sense of being silently hunted, and the terrifying realization that we had accidentally wandered into a world we should never have known. The memorable summer we craved became an unforgettable one in a completely different way, a stark reminder that there are places in this world that are best left alone. This national forest was supposed to be the place where I found myself again. After the startup, I poured my heart into collapsed, and a 3-year relationship dissolved within the same week. I needed a reset, a soul cleansing. Friends suggested loud city trips, but I craved absolute silence. I found it at a remote lakeside campsite, deep within a national park that even avid hikers rarely visited in the late fall. It promised solitude, just me, a placid lake, and the ancient woods. I drove for 6 hours, navigating increasingly narrow dirt roads until the final ranger station appeared. The ranger, an older man with a gray beard, eyed me skeptically when I mentioned my plan to camp alone for a week. He gave me a map, circled my area, and offered the standard advice. Be mindful of bears, keep food locked up, and don't stray far from the trail. But before I left, he paused, looked out over the lake, and said something strange. If you see anything unusual on the other side of the lake, just leave it be. I nodded, assuming it was a general warning about wildlife or illegal campers. The first 2 days were perfect, exactly what I needed. I set up my tent on a clearing that overlooked the water. The chilly November air made everything feel crisp. During the day, I hiked the gold leaf trails, feeling the peace seep into my bones. At night, I sat by the campfire, sipping hot coffee and gazing up at a star-filled sky unmarred by city lights. The silence was nearly absolute, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the wind whispering through the pines. Most of the other sites were empty. It seemed I was the only one crazy enough to be out here long after peak season. I truly felt like I was at the edge of the world, disconnected from all the chaos. It started on the third night. I was getting ready for bed when a flickering light on the opposite side of the lake caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just the moon's reflection on the water, or perhaps another camper using a flashlight. But the light didn't move randomly. It flashed in a pattern, a deliberate rhythm. 3 short flashes, 3 long, then 3 short again. Over and over. I'm no expert, but a vague memory from my Boy Scout days told me what it was. SOS, an urgent distress signal. I stood motionless, my heart starting to pound. Prank? Maybe a group of teenagers fooling around. But in a place this remote at this time of year, it seemed unlikely. The lake was wide. It would take forever to swim across. The other side was dense wilderness with no trails or campsites marked on the map. Someone might actually be in trouble. I thought about calling the ranger, but my phone had no signal here. The only option was to drive back to the station, but that would take at least an hour. If someone was injured, an hour could be too long. The old ranger's warning echoed in my mind. Just leave it be. But my conscience wouldn't allow it. What if a child was lost or a hiker had fallen and needed help? The urge to investigate, the slightly reckless, adventurous streak that had always been a part of me, finally won out. I decided to check it out myself.
I had a small kayak I'd brought along.
If it was serious, I'd come back and find a way to alert the authorities. I went into my tent, grabbed a large fixed-blade knife I used for bushcraft, and tucked it into my belt for protection. Launching the kayak into the black, cold water, I began paddling toward the light. The lake at night was hauntingly beautiful and terrifying. A light fog began to creep over the surface, and the silence now felt heavy, suffocating. The further I got from shore, the smaller and more vulnerable I felt. I had only the moonlight and the flickering light ahead to guide me. After about 15 minutes, the light abruptly went out, leaving me in total darkness. A sharp feeling of dread shot up my spine. Was this a trap? But I was halfway there, and turning back now felt as pointless as continuing. I kept paddling in the direction I remembered. Soon I made out the faint outline of the shoreline ahead. As I got closer, I saw a small structure, nearly hidden by the trees. It was an old, dilapidated wooden shack, looking like it had been abandoned for years. The roof sagged, and several planks on the walls were rotten. This definitely wasn't an official park structure. The light had been coming from a second-floor window of this shack. I pulled the kayak ashore as quietly as possible, trying not to make a sound. The adrenaline rush sharpened all my senses. I couldn't find a front door. Instead, I walked around the house and found an unlatched ground-floor window. After a moment of hesitation, I squeezed myself inside. The interior of the shack was eerily empty. Not just abandoned, but stripped bare. No furniture, no debris. The floors and walls were completely bare. The smell of mildew and rotting wood filled my nostrils. The place felt wrong, a deliberate emptiness. I moved cautiously, looking for the stairs. When I found them, I slowly ascended, each step groaning under my weight. I made a mental note of the window's location for a quick exit if needed. The upstairs hallway was just as empty. I moved toward the room I guessed had been the source of the light. The door was slightly ajar. I put my ear to it but heard nothing. Taking a deep breath, I carefully pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for one thing placed next to the window. It wasn't an old projector as I might have imagined, but an antique lantern, and in front of it a simple, homemade mechanism of wood and wire was rigged to continually open and close a metal baffle in front of the flame, creating the flashing effect. Alarm bells went off in my head. This was a deliberate setup. Someone had intentionally created the SOS signal to lure people here. The moment I realized it, I heard a floorboard creak from another room down the hall. I froze. Someone was in the house. Without another thought, I turned and bolted from the room. running full speed for the stairs. I heard a door burst open behind me, followed by heavy pounding footsteps. They were chasing me. I leaped over the last few steps, scrambling toward the window I'd entered through. As I was halfway out, I heard the footsteps right behind me, thundering down the stairs. I didn't dare look back. I dropped out of the window and sprinted at top speed toward the lakeshore, where my kayak was waiting. But when I reached the spot, my heart stopped. The kayak was gone. I spun around and saw a figure running toward me from the side of the house. I couldn't make out their face in the darkness, but they were large and moving fast. In pure terror, I pulled out my knife, ready to defend myself. But there was no time to fight. Without a moment of hesitation, I turned and plunged straight into the icy cold water of the lake. The shock of the cold nearly paralyzed me, but adrenaline kept me swimming. I swam as fast as I could, heading for the faint glow of my campfire on the other side, which looked miles away. The swim was an endless nightmare, my arms and legs burning with exhaustion. I didn't look back, focusing only on survival. When I finally dragged my shivering body onto the shore at my campsite, I was severely hypothermic. I stumbled into my tent, zipped it shut, and huddled in my sleeping bag, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't call the police or the rangers. I knew they wouldn't find anything. The guy had taken my kayak. There would be no footprints, no evidence, just an empty cabin and the crazy story of a lone camper. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat there listening, staring out at the dark lake, half hoping and half dreading that I would see the flickering light again. The next morning, as soon as the sun crested the horizon, I packed up in a frantic rush, threw everything into the car, and drove away without looking back. A year has passed since that night, and I've never been back to that lake. The experience has severely tainted my childhood image of the outdoors, and I can't say I'm eager to return anytime soon. I don't know who was in that cabin, why they set that trap, or what they intended to do if I hadn't escaped. I can't help but think that maybe the old ranger knew something, that his warning wasn't random. Perhaps there are secrets in those woods that outsiders should never learn. The place I sought for healing became the source of a new kind of fear, a persistent paranoia that sometimes when you look into the darkness, something is looking back at you, and it's patiently waiting. That summer was my third year as a counselor at Blackwood Pines summer camp. I thought I knew every inch of that forest, every cricket chirp, every whisper of the wind through the leaves. I used to love the absolute silence that settled after dark, once the kids were asleep in their wooden cabins, and it was just me and the dying embers of the campfire. That quiet didn't bother me. In fact, I enjoyed being alone with my work. But gradually I began to realize that camp at night was fundamentally different from the daytime. It wasn't just quiet, it felt dead. The old trees creaked and groaned as if they were breathing, and when you're the only one awake in a vast forest, even the smallest sound makes you jump. The camp was old, built back in the 1950s, and there was one place I never truly got used to: the boathouse by the lake. It stood isolated on the camp's northern edge, where the path was nearly swallowed by undergrowth. It was built of wood, dark from time and dampness, stretching out over Blackwood Lake. Inside was a chaotic maze of old canoes, broken paddles, mildewed life vests, and spiderweb-laden coils of rope. It always smelled of damp earth and rot. The only lights were two exposed bulbs hanging precariously, casting a weak, flickering yellow glow, and most of the time you needed a flashlight to see clearly. When I first started, one of the veteran counselors told me to stay away from the boathouse after sundown, unless absolutely necessary. He said it wasn't worth the hassle, and joked that it was haunted. I laughed it off. But even within the first week, I noticed the unsettling feeling of being near it. It felt like stepping into a different world from the warmth of the campfire area. Some nights while on patrol, I'd just glance down the path leading to it and feel a chill run down my spine. But usually I had no business there, so I always managed to avoid it. One late July night, about 2 years into the job, an unexpected storm was forecast to hit before dawn. The camp manager knocked on my cabin door, asking me to head down to the boathouse to pull all the canoes inside and secure them. I groaned at the request because the only place to store them was inside the boathouse. I remember standing at the head of the trail for a long time, debating whether I should tell him it could wait until morning. But I didn't want to seem lazy, so I grabbed my flashlight and raincoat and stepped into the darkness. The path rustled beneath my feet with every step, as if my boots were making too much noise. When I got there, I flipped the switch, but only one of the two bulbs lit up, leaving most of the boathouse in shadow. I swear the place smelled like wet lake mud. I turned on my flashlight and began the task. The canoes were loosely tied to wooden posts along the dock. I started untying them, dragging them one by one up the wooden ramp and inside. As I was pulling the fourth canoe, I froze. From somewhere in the back of the boathouse, in the darkest corner, I heard a faint scraping sound, like something was being slowly dragged across the wooden floor. I held my breath, my hands gripping the edge of the canoe, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I stood up straight, sweeping my flashlight beam into the darkness. The beam cut through the gloom, but there was nothing there. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, before rationalizing that it was probably just a rat, or perhaps I had accidentally shifted a paddle myself. I continued my work, pulling the remaining canoes inside. As I stepped inside the boathouse to arrange them, I suddenly felt a bone-chilling gust of cold air hit my face. It was so out of place that it stopped me dead in my tracks. The boathouse was always stuffy and enclosed, with no windows and no airflow. This felt like standing next to an open freezer. I swept the light around but saw nothing unusual. I shook off the feeling and went back to work. When I returned to the paddle storage area, something was wrong. The stack of paddles looked different, as if they had been shifted while I was outside. I frowned at them, trying to recall exactly how they had been stacked. Finally, I convinced myself I was paranoid and began tidying them up. This time, just as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A thump followed by a scrape. Came from the dock outside, where I had just been. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I shone it in that direction. About 20 feet away, the large wooden door of the boathouse, a door I was certain I had left slightly ajar, was now open by a narrow slit. My stomach clenched. I knew I hadn't touched that door. The entire camp was asleep, and no one was supposed to be here but me. I stood motionless in the entryway, staring at the opening. Every cell in my body screamed at me to drop everything and run, but I just stood there. I tried to cling to excuses like a life raft. Maybe the latch was loose, or maybe moving the canoes changed the air pressure. I quickly finished stacking the paddles and turned back, empty-handed, only holding the flashlight. The slit was still there, open just enough for someone to peek out. My throat was dry. I crept closer, each step echoing. As I neared, I called out, "Hello? Is anyone down here?" My voice cracked and sounded small in the vastness of the boathouse. No answer. I swallowed hard, then pushed the door wide open and shone the flashlight out. The dock was empty, only moss-covered wooden posts and the black mirrored surface of the lake. I stepped out for a moment, heart pounding, listening for any sound. That's when I heard it again. A wet, dragging sound, but this time it was right behind me, inside the boathouse. I whirled around, aiming the flashlight inside. The beam cut across the dark interior. Nothing, just shadows and overturned canoes. But I felt it. That heavy pressure you get when you know you are being watched. Goosebumps covered my arms. I didn't care about securing anything anymore. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed into the darkness of the boathouse, and found my way back to the trail. Once I was on the safety of the forest floor, I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, gasping for breath. I leaned against the wall, sweat slicking my skin despite the cool summer night. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was an otter or water slapping the hull of a boat, but I couldn't explain the open slit in the door. I locked my cabin door that night, which was against the rules. A week later, while leading a group of kids fishing near the boathouse during the day, I heard it again. 3 loud, deliberate knocks, as if someone was pounding on the wall from inside the boathouse. The kids didn't notice, but I froze. Then, I heard the boathouse door rattle as if someone had shoved it hard from the other side. My blood ran cold. I didn't open it. I just stood there, gripping the fishing rod until the sound stopped. After that, I refused to go near the boathouse alone. If anything needed doing there, I waited until another counselor could accompany me. I never told the others what I heard because I knew they'd either laugh at me or tell me it was the legendary camp ghost. but I knew what I felt, and what I heard was real. To this day, the thought of that slow, dragging sound behind me makes me sick. A few weeks later, working with another counselor, he told me that years ago, a camper boy was caught hiding in the boathouse overnight. He snuck in as a prank, but scared the staff so much that they never truly used the back storage area again. That seemed like a reasonable explanation, but it didn't account for the wet dragging I heard that night. No one else was at the camp at that hour. I finished my shift and left, but the thought of it still churns in my stomach. I never found out if it was a hiding kid or something else, but I will never forget the feeling of being watched from the darkness of that boathouse, a place that was supposed to be empty. Sometimes I still hear the sound in my head. I quit the job not long after that summer. Sometimes, even in crowded places, I still feel that cold pressure, and the sense of eyes following me from some dark place near the water. I know what I experienced was real, at least to me. The whole thing remains unsettling to this day. I've always believed there's a unique purity to the wilderness, a quiet that can wash away the noise of the city and the complexities of modern life. To me, the Monongahela National Forest was a sanctuary. It was where I went to recenter myself, to breathe in the crisp air scented with pine and damp earth, to listen to the symphony of the wind through the ancient canopies. And this time, I wanted to share it with Clara. We had been dating for a few months, our relationship blossoming from the digital world of a dating app, like so many modern love stories begin. Clara was different. She had a quiet intensity, an inner beauty that I found profoundly captivating. She wasn't outwardly loud, but more like a deep river, placid on the surface but with much beneath. This camping trip was my idea, a way to escape the typical restaurant and movie dates, a chance to truly connect amidst nature's grandeur. I had planned everything, from picking a secluded campsite by a small creek to preparing gourmet campfire meals. I wanted it to be perfect, but from the moment we left the city, I sensed a subtle shift in her demeanor. It wasn't a sudden change from teasing to malice like a past relationship I'd heard about, but a vague anxiety, a tension hidden behind her blue eyes. She kept glancing into the rearview mirror, her slender fingers restlessly tapping the dashboard. I tried to dismiss it, thinking she was just unfamiliar with venturing deep into the wild. We stopped at an old ranger station for a map and a permit. As I was talking to the elderly ranger, I noticed a rusty pickup truck parked in the distance. The man behind the wheel, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, was staring intently at my car, at Clara waiting inside. The look wasn't typical curiosity. It had a cold intensity, a focus that made me uneasy. When I looked back, he tilted his head slightly, then quickly turned away, started his engine, and drove off. I tried to shake off the discomfort, telling myself I was imagining things. As we drove deeper onto the winding forest road, the trees on either side rose like fortress walls, obscuring the sun. It was then that Clara confessed to me. She spoke about a man named Silas. They had been in a community college night class together, much like how Nikki had come to know her stalker. He was just a classmate on a group project, but then started sending strange messages. Clara had ignored them, hoping he'd take the hint. But it had escalated. Recently, he'd started texting again, and disturbingly, one of the messages mentioned my name. "Does he know where we're going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. She shook her head, but the uncertainty in her eyes was more terrifying than any confirmation. We reached the campsite just as the sun began to set. It was beautiful, exactly as I'd envisioned, but its peacefulness now carried a sense of menace. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made us jump. We set up the tent and built a fire in silence, the tension between us as thick as the evening fog that was starting to roll in. That night, as we sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment, I saw it. Across the creek between the darkened tree trunks, a flashlight beam flickered and then went out. I shot to my feet. "What was that?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer, just stared into the darkness. Maybe it was just another camper, but this spot was supposed to be completely isolated. Around midnight, after we'd zipped ourselves into the tent, I heard a sound. It wasn't the natural sound of the night forest. It was like metal hitting stone, I told Clara to stay put and stealthily unzipped the door. Outside, the faint moonlight illuminated a quiet scene. I circled the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. Our stack of camping chairs, which we had left leaning against a tree trunk, had been knocked over, scattered on the ground. There was no wind, and no animal large enough to do that without making a louder noise. Someone had been here. I went back to the tent, trying not to alarm Clara further, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, listening to every tiny sound, feeling like we were being watched from the surrounding gloom. I recalled the story of a boyfriend who had to confront his girlfriend's stalker in his own backyard, and a cold helplessness washed over me. At least he was on his own territory. We were miles from help deep in the wilderness. The next morning the fog was thick. We didn't exchange many words, just packed up frantically. The camping trip was ruined. The only goal now was to get out. As we drove back down the only dirt road leading out of the forest, the feeling of being hunted grew stronger. I constantly checked the rearview mirror, but saw nothing but the empty road behind us. We were about 3 miles down the desolate road, flanked by dense forest, when a loud pop rang out from the front of the car, followed by the screech of metal grinding on gravel. The car immediately swerved. I struggled to control the steering wheel as both front tires went flat. Shit, it wasn't random. This was a trap. The thought flashed through my mind, clear and terrifying. I quickly killed the engine and turned off the lights. "Get out of the car now," I told Clara. Confusion and panic were etched on her face. "Where will we go?" "The woods," I said, pulling her arm. "We have to hide." Just as we plunged into the tree line, I heard the sound of an approaching engine. We ran deeper in, branches and undergrowth scraping our skin. We found a small hollow under a large rock and pressed ourselves against the damp earth, trying to hold our breath. From our hiding spot, we could see the road. The rusty pickup truck from the ranger station pulled up right beside our disabled car. Silas stepped out. Even from a distance, I recognized his tall frame. He didn't say a word, just stood there, sweeping his flashlight beam across the edge of the woods. Time stretched out like a nightmare. We lay motionless, the chill of the damp earth seeping into our clothes. I could hear Clara's heart pounding next to me. Silas began walking along the tree line, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He was searching for us. I knew that if he found us here in this absolute isolation, no one would hear us scream. Suddenly, he stopped, right near our hiding place. The beam of his flashlight swept just above our heads. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. But then there was another sound, the engine of a different car approaching from the distance. Silas looked up, cursed under his breath, and quickly scrambled back into his truck and sped off, leaving us in the sudden dark and silence. We waited until we were certain he was gone before crawling out of our hiding spot. The second car was a family of campers who were startled to see us and our disabled vehicle. They drove us back to the ranger station, where we reported everything to the police. They caught Silas a few days later. It turned out his obsession with Clara went far beyond simple messages. Police found photos of her, her schedule, and even pictures of me on his computer. He had been tracking us since we left the city. Months have passed. Silas faced charges of stalking and harassment, and Clara obtained a restraining order. But the scars remain. We don't talk much about what happened in that forest. The silence between us is sometimes heavier than the darkness of that night. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, now evokes a terrifying memory. Its purity was tainted by human malice, and the quiet now carries the echo of fear. I don't know if our relationship can move past the ghost of Monongahela, or if it will always be haunted by the image of a man standing in the shadows and the sound of tires exploding in the silence of the woods.